How Jake McNiece used DP-27 in 1943 with iron patience to anchor a collapsing flank, rarely told. The DP-27 lay half buried in mud and spent brass, its pan magazine dented from the hard landing, cooling fins still warm against Jake McNiece's burned fingers. Rain hammered the mock hedgerows of Camp McCall, North Carolina, turning the October training ground into something that felt too much like the European bocage they'd been studying in intelligence briefings. 40 yards behind him, American voices were shouting retreat orders. 30 yards ahead, German POWs playing aggressor forces were advancing with an enthusiasm that had stopped feeling like theater 30 minutes ago when someone's rifle had started firing live rounds instead of blanks. McNiece's hands trembled as he fed the last drum into the Soviet machine gun, 73 rounds between holding this stone wall and watching the entire left flank of the Filthy 13's mock defensive line collapse. The weapon felt wrong in his grip. He was a demolition NCO, trained to blow bridges and culverts, not anchor defensive positions with crew-served weapons. But the bar gunner who was supposed to be here had taken shrapnel, real shrapnel, from a mortar round that wasn't supposed to have been anywhere near a training exercise. And now McNiece was the only man between chaos and complete disaster. The exercise had started simple enough. Lieutenant Morrison had briefed them in the dark at 0400. Simulate a defensive position after a scattered night drop, hold against German counterattack, demonstrate the 506th PIR's ability to reorganize under pressure. The Filthy 13, McNiece's squad of misfits and troublemakers, had drawn the worst sector deliberately. Morrison didn't trust them with anything that required spit and polish discipline, so they'd gotten the marshy low ground, the collapsing stone wall, the approach route that funneled straight into machine gun fire if anyone had the stones to stay and use it. What Morrison hadn't briefed was Colonel Hendricks's off-book decision to make the exercise more realistic by introducing live fire without warning. What he hadn't mentioned was that some of the German POWs, Wehrmacht veterans who'd surrendered in North Africa and been shipped stateside for labor details, had been given rifles with live ammunition and told to press the attack as if their own lives depended on it. What nobody had anticipated was that when metal started flying for real, 19-year-old paratroopers who'd never seen combat would do exactly what their training hadn't fully prepared them for. They'd break and run. McNiece adjusted the DP-27's bipod, sighting down the barrel toward the tree line where shadows moved with tactical precision. The Soviet gun was heavier than the Browning, slower firing, designed for patient, methodical defensive work. Everything Jake McNiece was not. He was the sergeant who'd told Captain Malarkey to find someone who gives a damn when questioned about the Filthy 13's refusal to shave or cut their hair to regulation. He was the demo man who preferred close-quarters chaos, satchel charges, det cord, blowing things apart at arm's length, not sitting still while the world tried to kill him from a distance. But behind him, his men were falling back through the mud and hedgerows. And ahead, the German POWs were massing for a final push that would overrun the position and turn the entire exercise into a rout that the 506th would never live down. So McNiece made a choice that would define him in ways the legend makers would never quite capture. He stayed, not because he was fearless, not because he didn't understand what staying meant, but because the alternative was watching men he'd trained with, fought alongside in mock battles, joked with over cigarettes and complaints about army food, watching them break completely. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. Tease Part 2. 24 hours earlier, McNiece had been sitting in the Filthy 13's barracks at Camp McCall, cleaning mud off his jump boots and listening to Private Jack Agnew complain about the upcoming field exercise. The autumn Carolina air carried the smell of pine smoke and distant artillery practice. Outside, other companies were running through close-order drill with the kind of precision that made McNiece's squad look like a collection of hobos who'd wandered onto a military base by accident. "They're setting us up," Anu had said, dragging on a hand-rolled cigarette. "Morrison gives us the shittiest sector, tells us to demonstrate initiative, then waits for us to screw it up so he can write us all up for Article 15s. McNiece had shrugged, working a rag into the crevices of his boots. Lieutenant Morrison wasn't wrong to distrust them. The Filthy 13 had earned their reputation through a combination of effectiveness and complete disregard for anything resembling military discipline. They were good at their jobs, demolitions, pathfinding, hitting targets behind enemy lines in simulated raids, but they refused to look like soldiers doing it. Long hair, war paint on exercises, modified uniforms, a general attitude of functional insubordination that drove officers insane and made other paratroopers either admiring or resentful. "We hold the line," McNiece had said quietly. "Whatever Morrison expects, we don't give him the satisfaction of watching us fold." But Morrison hadn't been the real problem. The real problem had been Colonel Hendricks, a battalion commander who'd never jumped into combat and seemed determined to manufacture the experience through increasingly dangerous training. Rumors had circulated for weeks that Hendricks was escalating field exercises, pushing men harder, introducing elements of chaos and danger that approached the real thing. Some soldiers whispered he was trying to impress division command. Others thought he was trying to wash out the men he considered too independent, too rough-edged. Men like the Filthy 13. The exercise had started clean. They'd assembled at the mock drop zone in darkness, simulating the confusion of scattered paratroopers regrouping after a night jump. McNiece's squad had been assigned to secure a defensive position along a low stone wall overlooking marshy ground and a farm road. The aggressor force, German POWs from the labor camp, would attack at dawn. Standard stuff. Hold until relieved, demonstrate fire discipline, coordinate with adjacent units. But dawn had brought something else. The first mortar rounds, supposed to be smoke simulators, had detonated with concussive force that threw dirt and shrapnel across their position. The first bursts of rifle fire, supposed to be blanks, had sent real bullets cracking past their heads. And the German POWs, instead of conducting a simulated probe, had advanced with the kind of coordinated aggression that suggested they'd been promised something more than routine labor duty if they performed well. Sergeant William Wild Bill Guarnere, positioned with another squad 200 yards to McNiece's right, had shouted over the chaos, "What the hell kind of training is this?" Then his section had started taking casualties, not simulated wounds marked with colored chalk, but real injuries from real ordnance that had no business being anywhere near a training ground. Lieutenant Morrison had appeared at their position 15 minutes into the exercise, face pale, radio handset pressed to his ear. "Pull back," he'd ordered, voice tight with confusion and rising panic. "This wasn't authorized. Hendricks has gone off script. We're pulling everyone back to the rally point." But pulling back meant exposing the flank. It meant leaving the stone wall and the marshy ground undefended. And McNiece had seen what the POWs were doing, massing for a coordinated assault that would hit the retreating Americans from behind and turn an orderly withdrawal into a massacre, training exercise or not. That's when he'd found the DP-27 in the weapons familiarization crate, drum magazine already loaded, someone's unauthorized souvenir from a shipment meant for technical study. That's when he'd made the decision to ignore Morrison's direct order and stay at the wall alone. Part 3. The first burst from the DP-27 was high and wide, rounds chewing bark off trees 50 yards from any actual target. McNiece cursed, adjusted his grip and fired again, 3-round bursts this time, forcing himself into the rhythm the weapon demanded. The Soviet gun didn't forgive spray and pray tactics. It required discipline, patience, measured fire, everything his reputation said he lacked. But the effect was immediate. The advancing POWs hesitated, dropped into cover, began shouting to each other in German. The assault momentum broke. They'd been expecting retreating Americans, scattered resistance, easy ground. Instead, they'd found a single stubborn machine gunner who refused to abandon the position everyone else had fled. Behind McNiece, he could hear Lieutenant Morrison screaming his name. "McNiece, fall back! That's a direct order!" The radio crackled with overlapping voices, company commanders demanding explanations, battalion staff trying to figure out who'd authorized live ammunition, medics calling for stretcher bearers. McNiece ignored it all. His entire world narrowed to the DP-27's sights, the weight of the gun against his shoulder, the count of remaining rounds. 46 bullets between holding this wall and letting his men get chewed up in a training accident that would haunt the 506th PR for the rest of the war. Movement to his right. McNiece swung the barrel, saw Private Agnew crawling through the mud with a bar and a bandolier of ammunition. "You stupid bastard," Agnew gasped, dropping into cover beside him. "You're going to get us all court-martialed." "Better than buried," McNiece said, firing another controlled burst. The DP-27's pan magazine rotated with mechanical precision, feeding rounds into the chamber with a reliability that felt almost alien compared to American weapons. "You didn't have to come back." "Yeah, I did." Agnew settled the bar onto the stone wall, started picking targets. "Because half the company is watching what you're doing, and if you hold here alone, they'll never forgive themselves. And if you die here alone, they'll never forgive you." It was true. McNiece could see them now. Paratroopers who'd been falling back were stopping, turning, taking up positions along the hedgerows and collapsed fences. Not because orders had changed, not because Morrison had suddenly authorized a defensive stand, but because one demolition NCO with a reputation for insubordination had decided that some things mattered more than following the plan. The POWs adapted quickly. They stopped trying frontal assaults and began probing the flanks, testing for weak points. McNiece shifted positions twice, dragging the DP-27 through mud and briars, reappearing 30 yards down the wall to fire from a new angle. The Germans couldn't fix his location. They couldn't mass for a coordinated rush without exposing themselves to disciplined fire from a weapon that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. A Wehrmacht veteran, older, scarred, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who'd fought on the Eastern Front, broke from cover 50 yards ahead and charged McNiece's position. He had a trench knife and eyes that said this stopped being an exercise for him the moment live rounds started flying. McNiece dropped the DP-27, pulled his jump knife and met him in the mud between the wall and the hedgerow. The fight lasted 8 seconds. It ended with both men on their backs, gasping, the German laughing with something between respect and bitter recognition. "You should be dead," he said in broken English, blood from a split lip mixing with rain. "On the Ostfront, you would be dead." McNiece spat mud, dragged himself back to the DP-27 and fired the last 13 rounds into the tree line. Then the whistles blew. Exercise terminated. Officers descended with clipboards and fury, and the world stopped trying to kill him. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Part 4. The immediate aftermath was chaos, compressed into bureaucratic language. Colonel Hendricks was relieved of command within 48 hours, escorted from Camp Macall by MPs while rumors spread about unauthorized ordnance, endangered training protocols, and a general's fury at seeing paratroopers bloodied in North Carolina instead of being saved for Europe. Lieutenant Morrison filed incident reports that would fill 3 folders by week's end. The German POWs were returned to their labor details with no explanation and strict orders never to discuss what had occurred. And Jake McNiece faced an Article 15 hearing for disobeying direct orders under fire. The proceedings took place in a Quonset hut, with rain drumming on corrugated metal overhead. Captain Malarkey presided, flanked by 2 other company commanders who'd lost men to Hendricks' reckless escalation. The charges were explicit. Willful disobedience of a commissioned officer's lawful order, reckless endangerment of personnel, unauthorized use of foreign weaponry in a training scenario. Morrison testified first, voice tight with conflicting emotions. I ordered Sergeant McNiece to fall back. He ignored me completely. He remained in position with a weapon he had no authorization to employ, and his actions directly resulted in other men returning to an exposed position against my explicit commands. The room fell silent. Then 16 paratroopers, men from 3 different squads, including 2 who'd never spoken to McNiece before the exercise, requested permission to testify. Private Agnew went first, still bearing bruises from the mud fight with the POW. If Sergeant McNiece pulls back when Lieutenant Morrison orders it, we're retreating across open ground with German aggressors, armed with live ammunition we didn't know they had, hitting us from behind. We'd have taken 20, maybe 30 casualties before anyone figured out what was happening. McNiece didn't save the exercise. He saved lives. Sergeant Guarnere testified next, his New Jersey accent cutting through the formal proceedings. I've seen men freeze. I've seen men panic. I've seen men do brave things because they're too stupid to know better. What McNiece did was different. He saw what was going to happen, calculated the cost of both choices, and picked the one that kept the most of us alive. That's not insubordination. That's leadership. The hearing lasted 4 hours. In the end, Captain Malarkey dismissed the charges with a statement that would appear in McNiece's service record, but never in official reports. Sergeant McNiece's actions, while technically in violation of direct orders, demonstrated exceptional judgment under circumstances that should never have occurred. The fault lies with command decisions far above his pay grade. Case dismissed. But the real judgment happened later, in the barracks, when Lieutenant Morrison found McNiece cleaning the DP-27 before returning it to the weapons depot. Morrison stood in the doorway for a long moment, rain-soaked uniform still muddy, face exhausted. I should court-martial you, Morrison said quietly. Yes, sir, McNiece replied, not looking up from the gun. But every man in this company would testify against me if I tried. Yes, sir. Morrison stepped closer, voice dropping. You know what scares me, McNiece? It's not that you disobeyed, it's that you were right. And next time in France, in Holland, wherever they send us, I might give you an order that gets men killed and you'll know it, and you'll have to choose between following me or saving them. McNiece finally looked up, meeting Morrison's eyes. Then give better orders, sir. Morrison left without another word. And McNiece finished cleaning the DP-27, hands steady now, the weapon's weight and balance already becoming memory. He understood what had happened, what it meant. He'd crossed a line. He'd shown he could be disciplined, patient, methodical. All the things his reputation said he wasn't, and that made him more dangerous than ever, because now commanders would expect him to pull off impossible things. Now his men would trust him to make the hard calls. Now he carried a weight that had nothing to do with demolitions or jump gear. Part 5. The Secret. Jake McNiece never told, the part that didn't make it into the stories the Filthy 13 told in bars years later, the part he couldn't explain to the hearing or to Morrison or even to Agnew in the quiet moments after, was how close he'd come to breaking. When he'd first picked up the DP-27, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely load the drum magazine. When the first POWs started advancing and he'd realized Morrison's retreat order meant exposing everyone to fire from behind, his mind had gone completely blank for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. He'd had a singular, crystal-clear thought. Run. Just run. Let someone else make this choice. The weapon had saved him, ironically. The DP-27's weight, its mechanical demand for patience and discipline, had given his terror something to focus on. He couldn't spray bullets and hope for the best. He couldn't rely on aggressive movement and close-quarters chaos. He had to sit still, breathe, count rounds, pick targets, fire in measured bursts. The discipline the weapon demanded had forced him into a version of himself he'd spent his entire army career avoiding. In the mud behind that stone wall, with rain hammering his helmet and German voices getting closer, Jake McNiece had discovered something worse than fear. He'd discovered he was good at being the thing he'd always rebelled against. He was good at discipline when it mattered. He was good at following the brutal logic of defensive fire, at calculating fields of fire and ammunition conservation. He was good at being the steady, reliable, by-the-book soldier everyone always said he could be if he just applied himself. And it terrified him, because now they'd expect it. Now they'd know he could do it. Now, every time a situation went sideways, commanders would look at him and think, McNiece held at Macau. McNiece can handle this. What they wouldn't know, what the after-action reports and the stories and even the sympathetic testimonies couldn't capture, was the cost of those 46 rounds. Every burst from the DP-27 had felt like it was firing pieces of his identity, the parts of him that had resisted authority and discipline and playing by rules that seemed designed to crush independence. He'd become, for 15 minutes, exactly what the army had always wanted him to be. And he'd hated every second of it, even as he'd recognized it was necessary. Private Agnew had come closest to understanding. 2 nights after the hearing, sitting outside the barracks with cigarettes and silence, Agnew had said quietly, "You look different. Behind that gun, you looked like you were somewhere else." "I was," McNiece had admitted. "I was being someone I don't want to be. But you saved us." "Yeah." McNiece had exhaled smoke into the Carolina darkness. "And now I'll have to be him again, that's the problem." There was another secret, darker and more complicated. The Wehrmacht POW who'd charged him with a knife, the veteran who'd fought on the Eastern Front, and recognized something in McNiece's eyes during those 8 seconds of mud and steel, had said something else before the whistles blew. He'd said it in German, but McNiece had understood enough from his pre-deployment language training. "You fight like a man with nothing to lose. That will get you killed, or it will make you a killer. Be careful which." McNiece hadn't told anyone about that. Couldn't explain why it had lodged in his mind like shrapnel. The POW had seen something McNiece was only beginning to recognize, that the line between courage and recklessness, between discipline and rigidity, between loyalty and self-destruction, was thinner than any official training suggested, and that the moments that looked heroic from outside often felt like barely controlled panic from inside. The DP-27 sat in the weapons depot now, cleaned and catalogued, a Soviet gun that had briefly become an American legend. But McNiece knew what it really was, evidence that he could be disciplined when necessary, patient when required, everything the army said soldiers should be. And that scared him more than any German patrol ever would. Because next time, in Normandy, in Holland, in some hedgerow or blown bridge or desperate defense, they'd expect him to do it again. And he wasn't sure he had another 46 rounds of that kind of patience in him. Part 6. The story spread through the 506th PIR with the inevitability of all good war stories, shifting, embellishing, becoming something cleaner than the mud-soaked reality. By December 1943, paratroopers at Camp McCall, who hadn't been anywhere near the stone wall, were telling their own versions. Some said McNiece had held off an entire company of aggressors alone. Others claimed he'd been wounded 3 times and kept firing. A few insisted the DP-27 had jammed halfway through, and he'd fixed it under fire using only a jump knife and pure stubbornness. McNiece let them talk. The legend was lighter than the truth, easier to carry. He didn't correct the embellishments or explain the fear or mention the Wehrmacht veterans' warning. The Filthy 13 absorbed the story into their mythology, proof that even the army's most undisciplined soldiers could pull off the impossible when circumstances demanded it. But 2 things changed after McCall, subtle shifts that McNiece felt more than observed. First, Lieutenant Morrison started asking for his opinion during mission planning. Not officially, not in front of other officers, but in quiet moments while studying maps or reviewing demolition objectives. "If we hit this bridge at night and the charges don't seat right, what would you do?" Morrison would ask. And McNiece would answer honestly, and Morrison would adjust the plans accordingly. The officer who'd written him up for insubordination 6 times was now treating him like a tactical advisor, and McNiece couldn't decide if that was promotion or curse. Second, the other paratroopers looked at him differently, not with the mixture of amusement and exasperation the Filthy 13 usually inspired, but with something closer to expectation. They'd seen him choose discipline over instinct, patience over aggression, and now, in their eyes, he'd become the man who could do both, break rules when necessary, follow them when it mattered. The weight of that expectation settled on his shoulders like jump gear that never came off. In April 1944, as the 506th prepared for deployment to England and the invasion everyone knew was coming, McNiece found himself standing in the weapons depot at Camp McCall one final time. The DP-27 was still there, tagged for eventual return to whatever supply chain had mistakenly shipped Soviet weapons to North Carolina. He didn't touch it, didn't need to. The weapon had already done its work. Private Agnew appeared beside him, following his gaze. "You think about it much, that day?" "Every time someone asks me to hold a position," McNiece admitted. "Every time they assume I'll pull off something impossible because I did it once in training." "You will, though," Agnew said quietly. "You'll do it because you can't help yourself. You'll see men who need someone to stay, and you'll stay. That's what scares you, isn't it? Not dying, becoming predictable." McNiece laughed, bitter and low. "Maybe I already have." They shipped out 2 weeks later. The Filthy 13 went to war with their reputation intact, wild, undisciplined, effective, but McNiece carried an additional burden. He carried the knowledge that when chaos demanded it, he could be the thing he'd spent years resisting. He could be disciplined, patient, methodical. He could count rounds and measure fire and hold ground while the world collapsed around him. 40 years later, in a VA hospital in Oklahoma, an older Jake McNiece would sit with a military historian, recording oral histories. The historian would ask about the famous incidents, the D-Day drop, the demolitions in Holland, the desperate defenses. McNiece would answer carefully, editing the fear and confusion into something closer to the legends. But when the historian asked about training, about Camp McCall and the Filthy 13's early days, McNiece would pause. "There was this exercise that went wrong," he'd say slowly. "Someone made bad decisions up the chain, and suddenly we were taking real fire in a training scenario. I ended up holding a position with a weapon I wasn't trained on, some Soviet gun they'd brought in for familiarization. The DP-27, the historian would supply, consulting notes. Multiple witnesses mentioned it. They say you anchored the entire defensive line. They say a lot of things." McNiece would look out the hospital window at Oklahoma scrubland, so different from Carolina pine forests, from Normandy hedgerows, from Dutch polders. "Truth is, I was terrified. I stayed because leaving meant getting people killed. But what haunts me isn't what I did. It's how easy it was, how natural it felt once I stopped fighting it and just let the discipline take over. Because after that, everyone expected it. In France, in Holland, everywhere. They'd look at me when things went sideways and I'd see it in their eyes. McNiece held at McCall. He'll hold here." "And did you?" the historian would ask. McNiece would smile, tired and complicated. "Usually, but the cost wasn't in bullets or blood. It was in knowing I could be the thing I'd sworn I'd never be, a good soldier. And once you cross that line, you can't go back. The rebellion becomes theater. The real war is with yourself." The DP-27 was eventually melted down in a post-war scrap drive, its Soviet steel recycled into American infrastructure. But the story remained, passed through generations of paratroopers as proof that even undisciplined troublemakers could rise to impossible occasions. What they didn't pass down What stayed with the men who'd been there, who'd seen McNiece behind that gun, was the look in his eyes. Not fear, not courage. Just grim recognition that he'd discovered a truth about himself he'd never wanted to know. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.